All right. Welcome and hello, everyone. Welcome to School of Speech presented by Speech Therapy PD. I want to thank everyone joining us today and a special welcome to those joining us from Speech Therapy PD's channel on YouTube. I'm Carolyn Dolby, and I am a practicing school-based clinician and your host of School of Speech. I'm so excited for today's episode. It is titled Back to Normal or New Reality: The Lasting Impacts of COVID-19 on School-Based SLPs, with our special guest, Lesley Sylvan. Hi, Lesley.
Hi
All right.
there. Thanks for having me.
Oh my God, so excited. All right, everybody, we're going to settle in, buckle up for another amazing episode. I do have a few things to mention. First of all, each episode of School of Speech is offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And before we started, Lesley and I were talking, and Lesley reminded me, she's like, can you believe that this is March 2025? And that is exactly 5 years ago that the pandemic hit the schools, where we all shut down. And we were kind of thinking, all right, we want to, I mean, not that we don't want to bring us down, because we're going to lift you up. Do you remember where you were March of 2020? I do. I was in Houston, Texas on spring break. Lesley, where were you?
I was still here in Montclair, New Jersey, and right when it was hitting me was also my spring break. I'm a professor at Montclair State University, and I remember thinking, maybe spring break will be a little bit longer. And then, just as the days went by, realizing that things were about to change so much. So
Yeah,
it's a crazy memory.
it's crazy.
I can't
So
believe it
those
was
of
five
you
years
listening,
ago.
yeah, I'm going to go over some of our disclosures. Okay, financial. For Lesley, just like she said, she is a salaried full-time professor at Montclair State University. She is also the author of Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Implementation Tools for Speech Language Pathologists in Education, which is published by Plural Publishing, that came out in 2021. And she does receive royalties for the sale of that book. And she's also receiving an honorarium from Speech Therapy PD for her participation today, with no non-financials to disclose. For me, I am a salaried employee of Portland Public Schools, and I'm compensated for the graduate courses I teach. And I'm also receiving compensation from Speech Therapy PD for hosting School of Speech. This is absolutely my dream job. Non-financial, I do consult for school districts across the nation in supporting and building their dysphagia programs, as well as staff training. Who cares about me? Let's learn more about Lesley. Dr. Lesley Sylvan is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Montclair State University, New Jersey. That's where my girlfriend's at. Woo, Nika. All right. She's also the program director of master's degree program. She is also the director of the master's degree in speech language pathology. Dr. Sylvan is a certified speech language pathologist with extensive clinical experience working with school-aged children, both in public and private settings. She completed her master's degree in educational policy and management, as well as a doctorate in human development and education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I mean, you're pretty cool. You're way cool. But broadly, Dr. Sylvan's scholarly interests center on the intersection between the field of education and the field of speech language pathology. We could not have a better expert with us today. Hey, Lesley.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm loving these comments in the chat about where people were 5 years ago. So thank you for all of that too. It's
Wow,
really
yeah, we've got
fun to see.
Orange County here. Oh, someone was just about to graduate. Oh, Katie from grad school. Oh boy. Oh, another one, Susan, spring break, NYC. Oh, some people were even out of the country in Canada. Oh my goodness. Whoa. Yeah, it was crazy for all of us. All of us. Wow. You know what? I know I'm going to ask you to tell us your journey, but I want to tell everyone before we do that, Lesley is a co-author of an article. It's Back to Normal or New Reality: How the COVID-19 Pandemic Continues to Influence School-Based Speech Language Pathologists. And I want to send that into the chat right now, if I can. Well, as I fumble around to do that, Lesley, do you mind telling us our journey? Get us started, and I am going to get this in the chat so everyone has access to. Oh, I think I did it. Okay. Yay. There's the link to the article. Wow. Karen just jumped on and said she was in Maine. She thought it'd just be 2 weeks. Exactly. I thought for sure that it would be just a couple weeks. We'd be back, no big deal. And then it was summer. Oh, it's so crazy. So crazy. Yeah. Oh, and
Crazy.
I see a lot of
So
us. Yeah. All right, get us started.
yeah,
How did you
absolutely.
get
I feel like we
here?
could stay on this reminiscing mode for a while, but
I
reminiscing with
know.
my
We kind
own
of,
life and my journey, it's hard to, decide where to start, but I was a biology major as an undergraduate. And as I was graduating, I was thinking about all the different things that I was interested in, like linguistics and education and human biology and systems. And I came to find speech language pathology, and I thought this is amazing because it's an interdisciplinary field that really brings together so many different areas that were of interest to me. So I was interested in kind of that intersection of education and speech language pathology and science right from the start. And I've kind of stayed right in that place with the intersection. And I really like thinking about different things and how they fit together. So after I finished my master's degree in speech language pathology, I went right to public schools, first in New York City. So I think I saw some New York City people on the chat, and then on the opposite coast in San Francisco. So got kind of a taste of all kinds of different schools and different settings, and just had a lot of questions about how educational policy is implemented and put into play as I was looking at my caseload and the work that I did, thinking about, why is this student eligible, but this student who's sitting next to them seems to have some of the same struggles. Why are they not eligible, right? How does this all play out? And thinking a lot about eligibility, why policies were written in the way that they were, what frameworks influence SLPs in their decision making. And I thought, I need to do more education on this, but I really wanted to look at it from an educational lens, which led me to get my master's degree in educational policy and then my doctoral degree in human development and education. And I feel like I've been really fortunate to kind of stay at that intersection and really think about that intersection as I've gone forward in my career. Now I teach classes about preparing to be a school-based SLP at Montclair State University and about looking at research and help organize my program and thinking about higher education and how that intersects with speech pathology. So that's, I guess, the beginning of my journey to share.
I love it because most of my career well, almost all of it. I did do some home health and some medical to get my dysphagia stuff up and running, but my 25 year careers mainly been education. I started out actually as a teacher. That was how I got started before I went back. Yeah. So public school is my jam. I love it. That's why we're all here too for School of Speech. But then now I want to know. So I love the fact that you are in that intersection of SLP and education because that's where we all are.
That's
But
right.
then right? So welcome everyone to our intersection. How did you decide to study the impact of the pandemic? What brought that on? Besides
Yeah.
the
So
pandemic.
besides the pandemic.
Yeah.
So back in March of 2025, we're all kind of going back and remembering that time. I was like a lot of you, thinking maybe it would be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we'd kind of, pop back to normal.
Yeah.
But it became really quickly clear, right, to all of us that this is going to be a major disruptor, right, in society in general, and K through 12 schools. And I was thinking, how is this impacting school-based SLPs? And even as it seemed like it might last forever, I knew it was like a moment in time, right? So it was almost like I almost put on my historian hat and thought, we need to capture what's happening to school-based SLPs at this moment because things will continue to change, right? Even as the pandemic continues, things will continue to change. But this crazy moment when schools are shutting down and everyone is scrambling to move good online, what is happening right at this moment? So looking back, it's hard to believe, but I got a whole research study together, IRB approval, and I did the first survey about the impact of the pandemic on school-based SLPs in May 2020. So right away, I was thinking, what is happening in schools? And the response to that survey was amazing. Sometimes you do surveys and it takes, a couple weeks and you're getting like a scattering of responses, and people were responding right away, hundreds of responses. I felt like people really wanted to share what was happening. And I wanted to quickly turn that around so that we could all kind of see what was happening with each other and really document that moment in time. And I called the first article that I wrote, Capturing a Moment in Time. It was called Capturing a Moment in Time, a survey of school-based speech language pathologists' experiences in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 public health emergency. And you can see how even in the title, we didn't call it a pandemic from the beginning. It's interesting. Now we look back and we think, that's the pandemic. But at the beginning, it was a public health emergency. Was it really going to be called a pandemic? How long was it going to last? So I wanted to do research to capture that moment. And then, even as the next school year started, the beginning of the 2020-21 school year, things already started to change. So I did another survey pretty quickly after that in December through January called Another Moment in Time. And so that was a really different year too, right? Some people were going back, some people were all virtual. There was a lot of differences in that year. And so it was partially that I just wanted to capture that for our collective memory, everyone's experiences. And that was what drove me initially to do that research.
Wow. You hit it when you said, I think we all feel the same way. I did not think it was when it first happened. I was like, oh, this isn't going to last. And then it just kept going and going. And then everything changed. Everything changed.
Everything changed. Right. And then it almost became normal. You got used to one thing that everything changed. Like, okay, we're all online. We got used to that. And then it was hybrid, where a lot of people had this kind of awkward hybrid where some kids were in school, some kids were online. There were different days. They'd be back for a little while. Schools would close for 2 weeks. So, once you kind of got used to that, then things changed again, so there were kind of phases looking back.
There was no normal because depending on what part of the country you're in and what school district you're in, things were very different. I feel like things shut down a little later. I was in Texas at the time. I now live in Oregon, but I was in Texas. I felt like we shut down a little later, or we were kind of a little bit behind kind of the rest of the country, especially like back east. And then we had to quickly learn. How many of us, if we had never done teletherapy before, I mean, how many of us?
People hadn't, in that initial survey, I had a question, who's done teletherapy before? And over 90% of people said they had not. So it was a very unusual to have experience with teletherapy. But suddenly overnight, we were all teletherapists, right?
And the thing about being school SLPs, they really think that we have superpower. They expected us to immediately be an expert. And I think if I don't know, I know I'm having a physical response of the stress that had on all of us, of having to quickly pivot. And then and when you think about the population that we are servicing in the schools, which is a lot of it is the special ed. Well, they're all under special ed, but a lot of special needs children, and the effect of the pandemic and going virtual for those students too. Oh, it's huge.
It was huge. And, we were really on the front lines as school-based SLPs, talking to those families, talking to those parents, seeing those kids and helping them manage, right? Like, what is Zoom? What is the Zoom link? Some of these things that now we almost take for granted, right? Most people understand what a Zoom link is, but it was brand new. And that was just 5 years ago. It was just 5 years ago. We're not talking about ancient.
No, you just like things were just jumping in my head. For example, not all families had, first of all, computers, let alone internet. There were so many things that we were not prepared for. Our families were not prepared for. My daughter at the time, we worked at the same district. She was the choir director at my district. It's so much fun. She was telling me one of her jobs was actually going on a bus with the assistant principal, going to the homes and handing out materials and supplies for the families, making sure that they had what they needed. I mean, everybody pitched in. Everybody was doing everything that they could do. But oh man, wow. That was a little shout out to my daughter. Truly, love you.
It's wild looking back. And then, the most recent study, which I did, which I think you just shared in the chat, was at the beginning
Hmm.
of the 23-24 school year. And by then, in some ways, we'd almost stopped talking about the pandemic, right? In May of 2023, the World Health Organization said, there's no longer a global international emergency. It was kind of like the
Hmm.
official end of the pandemic. But that was only 3 years later. And I was thinking, we
Hmm.
don't just have this major disruptor and then boom, swing exactly back to where we were, right? Like,
Oh,
there are still things that are continuing to impact us as professionals. Even now, like we're starting to remember the stress, right? That was even more recent,
oh,
beginning of the
yeah.
23-24 school year, and families and children and school systems too. So even though we weren't necessarily talking about it all the time anymore, right? Everybody was kind of anxious to get back to normal. Like,
Mhm.
what was still happening in terms of how it was impacting our profession? And from our profession's point of view, the students that they serve, the communities that they serve. So that was my motivation for that study, is like, what can we learn from that moment of extreme disruption, and how are we still dealing with the repercussions of it, even though we're not masking, we're not. The other day I
Mhm.
was cleaning out something in my house and I found like this pile of masks, and I was like, it almost looks strange, right? Like it used to be like a daily everyday thing, and hadn't really looked at one or touched one in a little while. But how is it still impacting us in ways that are tangible or intangible, that we can think about or we can even learn from, right? As we continue to improve our practice as speech language pathologists.
Yeah, I think we do feel that things are different. The
Mhm.
children that are coming to us are have been impacted. Especially like earlier you said, those children that were born in 2020 hit 5 are now coming to kindergarten.
That's
So
right.
there it's the impact of the pandemic on those children. So it's still here with us. What do you find when you during your study? What did the SLPs say that they found like the biggest impact of the pandemic?
So there was a few.
Mhm.
First of all, I asked them, do you think there's still an impact of the
Oh, that's a
pandemic?
good
And
question. Yeah.
the majority, 98%, said yes, right? In some way or another, there's still an impact. And some of the biggest impacts were social emotional skills of their students, academic gaps that they noticed
Hmm.
with their students, and then speech and language delays of varying kinds. I mean, I think it's always the eyes that we have, right? I think speech language
Hmm.
pathologists, we're looking at speech and language all the time. So there was a variety of answers. I asked about this in sort of an open-ended format so that I could see what people came to mind, but then looked at it thematically. And those were the top three in terms of what they were noticing from their students. Social emotional difficulties, academic gaps, and then speech and language concerns increased.
I agree. Really, when we look at the social emotional, because of everybody was impacted.
Mhm.
Everybody. And but then people were impacted differently. How much support did they have at home?
Yeah.
What the trauma that families were going through? Some families had jobs that they were able to work remotely. I think back on the service industry, on how many people
Mhm.
that you can't do that virtually. The impact of these kids. So I guess it kind of leads us into like what did it change when we're thinking about like our curriculum, how we are providing services? What do we know now doing that's different, do you
So
think?
it's a really interesting question, because in some ways there are certain things that we're doing differently, but in other ways we're kind of back the same, right? Like the contrast was, most survey respondents said, yes, the pandemic impacted the students and it's continuing.
Hmm.
But then a lot of people, when they said, how does that impact your intervention or your
Yeah.
assessment, said, well, it doesn't change it that much, right? And in some ways that was like a difficult disconnect to navigate, right? And some of the comments were like, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to do things differently. Like there were some things that people talked about doing differently, like relying less on standardized tests, for example, right? And there was a lot of comments of people saying, these tests were normed on children that didn't go through the pandemic. And it was even more
Hmm.
relevant, like the closer to the pandemic we were. So, now I'm giving this test and I'm seeing this score, but the children that are in this normative sample, they didn't miss maybe a year of in-person instruction. So
Right.
how valid is that score really? But then how hard is it to tease out what to do instead, right? And one thing that didn't change after the pandemic was the curriculum, the
Mm-hmm.
expectations, the standards, the norm reference tests. They didn't change.
Right. Nope.
Policies didn't change, eligibility, so it was kind of like this disconnect, like the kids have changed, but the expectations, both for the kids and for us, were not changed, right? No one said, okay, SLPs, we're going to decrease your caseloads in half because things are so much more complicated, right? Like that. I wish, right?
If that happened, let us know where you are.
Yes, exactly. But so there was kind of a disconnect.
Ah,
And I think individual SLPs and their responses, and in some of the presentations and discussions I've done since, I've heard about ways that people have tried to adapt, but there has been sort of a bit of a lack of concrete guidance about what to do. In some ways, as much as it was a disruptor, once we sort of got back to reality, it was like, all right, go back to doing what you do. And I think, some people talked about changes in group sizes,
mm-hmm.
materials that they used, like using more virtual materials because they learned about a lot of amazing materials in the pandemic, like boom cards or others.
Mm-hmm.
Or on the other hand, people saying, I don't use any digital technology with my students because I feel like they got overloaded in that. So whereas before I might have gotten it on an iPad, like it's kind of novel, now I feel like kids have gotten too much tech. And so I only use hands-on materials because of the pandemic. So different
Oh,
people,
wow.
different ways of kind of thinking about it. Some people were like, I love my like my digital tools. I use them all the time. Whereas others were like, I think that's too much. Like kids had too much tech and now I want to move away from that. So it's really variable in terms of how people have responded.
Well, I was going to go back to your intersection of education and SLP. And I want to know, my question was the thought of like, when children are receiving their education, their curriculum virtually, which was new not only to them, but also to the educator,
Mhm.
was there an impact on education? I guess I don't know, quality of the education? Did we see a vast difference of children that were on level? Were the standardized tests and the state testing didn't change? But what
Mm-mm.
about the children's knowledge? And I guess I would love to know more about, is there some data that shows that there are these educational gaps for kids depending on how old they were during the pandemic and what they missed?
So there is a lot of research on this, honestly. And, one of the things that it stands out the most is it really exacerbated existing inequities. And
Mm.
so, children that had been previously, maybe from what we would think of as a disadvantaged background, right? Low income children, children that have historically sort of underperformed on standardized tests of academic achievement, they were impacted disproportionately negatively. And that gap continues to persist. There's always been a gap, right? Sometimes we call it the achievement
Right.
gap, but there's a lot of different ways of describing it. But that gap between children that are higher performers or lower performers for lots of different reasons, also children with disabilities, right? I mean, that would be included in that group. And children that had historically been doing, performing less academically well, that gap just widened. And so that is something that continues to be documented. I mean, there's a lot of variability, state to state. There's starting to be more research. It takes time for this really to come out about, timings of reopenings, et cetera. But there certainly were these gaps that were exacerbated. And then there were some children that there are no gaps, right? And, progress kind of continued as normal. So it was very uneven. It wasn't
Mhm.
like, if you happened to be in third grade when the pandemic hit, that hit you worse than if you were in first grade, right? It mattered necessarily less about your age or your grade, but, some of the circumstances that you mentioned, like, family stability,
Yeah.
the trauma that was experienced, right? And sometimes those things can go hand in hand, unfortunately. So it was a very uneven, which which makes it difficult, right? Because SLPs that work in different kinds of schools may now be experiencing the lasting impact of the pandemic in variable ways, depending on, the nature of the population that they're working with or the school setting that they're in.
Like, do you think that there was an uptick in eligibility, that more students appeared? How am I trying to say this? Do you feel that there was a higher, I kind of felt like more children were being referred. That's the question I'm asking.
Mhm.
More children were being referred for speech service or special ed services post-pandemic. I
So
don't know for
again,
sure. I
yeah,
think maybe, but I think I feel it, but I don't know it. So I guess I'm fact checking myself. So what do you
and
think?
based on what I have in my study, and I asked questions about this,
Mm-hmm.
again, there was variability with some people saying, yes, referrals are through the roof. There's so many
Mm-hmm.
more kids that parents are concerned about, teachers are concerned about, and they're showing speech and language skill, delays, and it's a lot to manage. Whereas some other people said, in fact, there's less because everybody is looking more, everybody is struggling, right? And so they're not standing out as much as maybe they would have, right? Because it's kind of like the whole class isn't at grade level. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
before, maybe there was a few kids, that were struggling and they were the referrals. And so people were saying it's kind of confusing now for teachers too to think about who to refer when there's more almost like a universal struggles. And
That's
it's
fascinating.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of made people think more about, which is my other area of, passion you mentioned with multi-tiered systems of support, like
Yes.
how can speech language services be more of like a universal support for kids or more
Mm-hmm.
prevention oriented? Because we were starting to see there's not this great difference between the kids that have had the referrals and all these other kids are struggling with the same thing, right? We know that it's not appropriate for all of them to be labeled as disabled, right?
No.
Not the intent. That's not the idea of eligibility. But there are a lot of kids that are struggling. And well, we need to differentiate, right? Which ones need IEPs and which ones don't. There's so many kids that our expertise could be extended towards. And I think there was a greater realization, like, how can we use our expertise, of course, to identify the children that we need on our caseload, but also to help everybody, because in certain settings there were a lot of kids, way more than we could ever handle and put on a caseload that were struggling in terms of speech and language or academics and literacy, that kind of
Absolutely.
thing.
Absolutely. But I do you, okay, I'm asking because I don't know the answer to this. Do you feel that there should be a change in norms, like social pragmatic norms for our children coming that experience that?
This is a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, right? Like, should we change the norms? Should we change the expectations? And in some ways, I feel like, on one hand, I think yes, right? Because all these kids are struggling. And so we want to have
Mm-hmm.
kind of a different norm, like it's a different reality for them. On the other hand, I think let's keep those same high expectations, right? For all children, just
Uh-huh.
because they went through the pandemic and maybe it's still continuing to hit them, we want to get them back to where they would have been had that not happened, right? You're only a child once. Like,
Right.
it wasn't your fault that, you missed third or fourth grade or wherever it hit you. And, rather than changing the expectations, maybe think about changing the way that we support kids to meet those expectations with the extra support that they might need, and moving away from sort of this binary idea of like either you get support through special education or you get no support at all because you're not qualified for special education, right? Thinking about different tiers of support or different
Mm-hmm.
differentiated levels of support, and thinking that it's more the norm that kids need support rather than the exception, right? And the kind of support they need could vary. Some kids, it could be social emotional support.
Mm-hmm.
Reading is a big thing. I think reading instruction was very difficult online for lots of different reasons.
Right.
Writing, a lot of things. So it's not necessarily that everybody needs the same, but this idea that support can be more universal, I think it kind of makes more of the case for that. But it is a good question about norms, right? It is a good question.
Yeah.
And, hopefully one day this will really be in the rear view and we don't want to have changed the norms we're going to change them back,
That's a good point. Yeah, exactly. And after I asked the question, I kind of thought that too, like, oh yeah, would we have to go back? But now you made me think about service delivery.
Mhm.
Because the thing, a word that you said, that prevention, right? That preventative services. What could we be doing? How could we be, well, in your survey, I think one of the questions you did ask is how did service delivery change?
Mhm.
What was the
Right.
result of that?
So, a lot of people had said their service delivery hasn't really changed, but they feel like maybe it should, right? And they
Okay.
were trying to kind of figure that out. People were saying there were varying things, but they were like, kind of doing things a little bit similarly, but it's not necessarily feeling like it's the same as it was, right? So maybe what used to work for you, I don't know, having pull-out sessions twice a week for 30 minutes, right? Like that's a very common sort of
Right.
service delivery model, but people were starting to say like, I'm doing it the same, but I'm not feeling like it's as impactful as maybe it was. It feels different. And I'm exploring different ways of doing things. Like I'm thinking more about, should my service delivery model be more, push-in, collaborative, bringing services to the classroom? I had some questions about, are you more engaged with prevention-oriented services
Mhm.
or, with RTI, multi-tiered systems of support? These kind of fall under the same bucket. And do you think that there's a need for you to be? Most people, like well over 95% said, I think there's a need, right? I think there's definitely a
Oh, yeah,
need,
absolutely.
but, am I doing it or am I exploring about doing it? I think people weren't sure how to jump right into that. I think it's even starting to change since the beginning of the 2023 school year, right? Like now we're in a new school year.
Mhm.
People are continuing to reflect on that. I haven't done a new survey, but, thinking more about how they can adapt their services to, you know, promote generalization and to also, incidentally benefit or bring support to even more students that are identified on a caseload. So there wasn't an immediate, SLPs can only be so flexible, right? We pivoted to the
I
pandemic,
know.
pivoted back, and, the first instinct, which I think is totally understandable, is like, let's see if we can get back to reality, right? Like, let's get back to what we knew was going well. But then there's kind of like the feeling, well, is this working the same way? And then even
Mhm.
questions of, was this ever the best way, right? Like, it's an opportunity to reflect on ways to transform practice too, right? Like, it's an opportunity to learn.
I support that. I come from a very positive outlook. I always want to find the best. I always want to find that, as my sister say, the joie de vivre. I'm always like, yay. And because I mean, we all know it was daunting and hard for all of us. But one of the things I think that I really like that came out of it is Zoom.
Mhm.
And virtual meetings, Google Meet, however platforms, that changed. That was a game changer for me, being that I'm a district level clinician going to campuses across my district. Yeah, I have to be in person doing the hands-on, but if I'm following 90 plus when I was in Texas and 80 plus now that I'm in Oregon, still a lot of campuses when it comes to the meetings. I wasn't able to physically get to the campuses for the meetings, but now that we're all so much more tech savvy, I wish I was even more, but that's, old dog. But how much more I'm able to attend, and to me I feel like I'm providing better customer service because I am able to go to more meetings and attend more meetings because they are virtual. Was that a
Right.
positive? Does everybody else
Yeah.
think that's a positive? I do. What does
That's
everybody think?
interesting because
Yeah.
I did ask about that because I was thinking right along the same lines as you, right? I feel like it used to be the norm, just completely the norm. No one even thought of anything else, right? That if we were going to have
Yep.
an IEP meeting or a school meeting, it'd be in person. If you couldn't make it, it'd be great if you could, but you can't be in two places at the same time.
Yeah.
That's it. And now it's almost like the vast majority of meetings, IEP meetings, are online. And I ask
Yeah.
people, do you feel like this is more effective, equally effective, less effective? And I'd say that the most popular answer was, equally effective, or people saying more effective because, like you were just mentioning, I work on multiple campuses and sometimes it was hard with scheduling. But what's interesting too is that with people saying it was less effective, there were some. And so I think that reminds us with anything that's kind of like a silver, like there's a pro and there's a con, right? Like there's kind of two sides of it. And I had and a lot of opportunities in the survey to select answers, but then to give feedback, like written feedback, because I feel like that's kind of where you get the subtleties, right? Or the nuances. And some people were commenting, oh, I never really meet people's families. Like I feel like I don't
Right.
have that connection where I used to maybe at the beginning of the meeting kind of get to know them. There's things about sitting down with someone in person that you feel or that you can cover or a relationship that you can build that's just different. It doesn't mean that can't happen virtually, but we all feel the difference, right? Meeting a friend for coffee versus meeting a friend for a Zoom chat, you have a different feel, right? And I think that some people were saying relationships with families, connections that they had over the years, it felt more straight to business, right? You get on a Zoom call and you start talking about what you need to do and you're off. You're not kind of
Mhm.
seeing the brother that's sitting there, having those side conversations. And similarly with professional development, I ask people like, compared to the pandemic, how often do you do professional development virtually? Huge increase, right? In terms of
Mhm.
people doing professional development virtually and a lot of pros, convenience, flexibility. But then in terms of district meetings or professional development within a district, some people were saying like, I miss seeing my colleagues in person. Some of those casual one-to-one conversations that build communities, I feel a little bit more alone, right? Like I just joined this district. I don't even know any of my colleagues. Like I've seen them on Zoom, but a lot of times SLPs are the only ones in the building, right? They may not know all the SLPs in the district. And, there's a little bit of a social element, right? You come, oh, I work at this school. I used to work there. It's not what's on the agenda, but sometimes those side conversations can be valuable and, build networks. So it's something gained and something lost, right? And, what's gained, I think, is really powerful, like you were saying. And, I'm seeing a couple comments. I have the chat open too, because I always
Oh, good.
see what
Yeah,
people
because
are
I was saying,
saying, for working
yeah.
parents, it's really convenient. But, and there can be more family involvement because, people can join more flexibly. I have two kids. I love it, right? Like if I need to meet with the teacher, I don't have to leave work, drive over, find a parking spot. I can meet with teachers pretty flexibly, but at the same time, you don't get to know there's a difference. And how do we capture that and think about it too? So that was one of my favorite things about this study is that it highlighted a lot of issues and both sort of like the positive sides and the drawbacks and just raises a lot of things for us to think about.
And I get it that it is less personable, but again, I come from this, let's find the silver lining.
Oh,
What
absolutely.
I love about that, a lot more of the related services can join. There's a lot more, I feel. Megan, to your question, do I feel like I'm doing more work because I'm attending more meetings? Yeah, actually, in a way, I guess. But then no, because I have more time because I'm not having to take time driving to the location, I would have still done the work. I would have still, for me, being the dysphagia support speech pathologist, I'm maintaining their feeding plans of care, updating their PLAF, doing I've already talked to the parent, I've already seen the child. So all that work I would have already done. And so I guess it's a boon for me because I've already had to do all of that work. And instead of asking the campus speech path or the IEP facilitator or the case manager, whatever they may be in the district I'm at, to provide my information, even though I've already called a parent, but this way I can be there. So then if there is a quick question for me, or even a long question, it doesn't matter, I can answer the question, or I can say, hey, this is a great question. Let's get through the IP. I'll call you afterwards and we can discuss it more. So maybe not more work, more chances for me, for families to be able to interact with me. I know I'm a little bit different entity than the campus SLP, but any of the related services, a lot of them are unable to get to meetings because they're on a different campus. So I think it's depending on your discipline. It is, for me, I think I really enjoy the virtual, but again, when you hit it when you said district meetings. A lot of, that meme that says that could have been an email, right? So some of that is true. Like some of the stuff you're telling us really could have just been an email, and that could have been. So some of those virtual meetings are great because we're multitasking. But the downside of how much are we multitasking during those virtual meetings and maybe not really there? I find, I don't know. That was a kind of a downside of it, is because I do trainings virtually on student plans of care. And when I'm there, I am really funny in person. I am a delight. I am
You're
such a
funny here.
delight.
The light on Zoom as well. The light on Zoom as well, definitely.
And so when I'm there, I'm feeding off the energy of the staff. I'm reading the room. I'm getting energized about it. And then sometimes you're right. Oh, I'm going back and forth. Yeah. And then sometimes virtually, I'm all like, "Meh, meh." I'm just talking to my head.
Yeah. I feel the same. I do district training sometimes as well. And when I'm in person, it's always a hassle, right? Depending on
Yeah.
where it is and the travel. And I love to do virtual things too for all the reasons. And I think we all do, right? But then sometimes I just see gray boxes and I think, oh
Yeah.
man, like I don't know who is listening, what's happening. And I think it's not to take away from any of the positives of the silver linings that came out,
Mhm.
right? It's just to kind of think about what are the trade-offs and acknowledging them too, right? Especially with this, district meetings. And I think that more than anything else, that's where it came out in the survey, is just getting a chance to socialize and meet your colleagues, right? Maybe the meeting could have been an email, but the
Mhm.
conversation that you had walking in the door where you said, oh, I've had a rough day, and someone said, oh, I've had days like that, here's something I tried, or how's something I did. It wasn't on the agenda. And you don't have side chats in Zoom necessarily,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Oh,
Don't
yeah.
have that. And, making friends, meeting other people that have the same job as you, like that can be really powerful in terms of like community and support. I mean, on the flip side, I've made some nice friends online myself, right? Like there can be a lot more ways. One of the findings from my first study about the pandemic was how much people loved learning from other SLPs all around the country in a way that they hadn't before, because they felt
Mhm.
like everybody jumped into action, sharing resources on social media, on different sources, and they felt like, wow, everybody really stepped up to support each other, right? An SLP in Texas made some materials, put them online, and an SLP in Oregon, right,
Yeah.
using them. That happens
Absolutely.
a lot more. So it kind of felt like this sense of a big community, right? Not necessarily the SLP next door, but the whole community helping each other. And I think that that was one of the initial, like, real silver linings, is feeling like the powerful, positive energy of the school-based SLP community just helping everybody, regardless of
Amen.
district, location.
We
I
were
find it
all.
so interesting, like the upsides and the downsides, and neither one cancels each other out, right? There's just a lot
I
to reflect on.
we find the best, as Carolyn, in the words of Carolyn. Yes, we're always going to find, I always like find the happy spot. I always want to find like the positive of it. But now oh wait, now I just forgot what I was going to ask. I'm sure it was profound as well.
Absolutely.
Oh, now I know it. I remembered it now. Okay. So we're looking, case sizes are not going down, right? Caseloads are not going down. We talked a little bit about service delivery, but I want to talk about virtual teletherapy. And because we still have such a need for a need for SLPs. We don't have enough. We need more. Make more, Dr. Sylvan, make more. We need more of
I'm
us.
trying.
So in your studies and in the research, is there any data that you can lay on us regarding the benefit or the benefits of whether being in person or teletherapy? Is one better than the other, or are the outcomes similar?
So I love that question. I don't know that I have the exact answer.
I know it's a big one. I know. Sorry, that was a big
One thing that was very interesting is that when I did the most recent survey in 2023, I had a questions to say, are you day to day an in-person therapist or a virtual therapist, right? I didn't even think about asking that in 2020 because it was so rare, right?
No.
But there was a percentage of people that answered the survey that are school-based SLPs that work in full virtual positions, not because of the pandemic, just that's the position that they have, right? Their students maybe go to school and they are a virtual SLP. And I had specific questions for them on my survey about, how did you decide to become a virtual SLP? Were you a virtual SLP during the pandemic? And one thing that I thought that came out, which was very interesting, more from the professional side, right? Less about maybe the student impact side, is that a lot of people were talking about, well, I never thought about being a virtual SLP before, but in the pandemic, I did it and it turned out I loved it. And I didn't want to stop doing that. And, in some ways, it opened up the door for so many people to even contemplate being a virtual therapist that may have never thought of it. Right on my first survey, 90% of people had never done it. Now most people have at least tried it, right? The pandemic kind of accelerated people's training and exposure to it. And so there are some SLPs that said, once I started doing it, I realized that that's what I prefer to do. And now this is really where I want to stay. And I thought that that was very interesting. Most of the people that, now this doesn't capture everybody, right? You never capture everyone's experiences on a survey. So I can't speak for everybody out there, but some of the responses on my survey were like, I wasn't a virtual therapist in the pandemic or before that, but then this opened up my eyes and I decided to do that. And then I did another recent paper, which was just recently published, about how virtual speech language pathologists can engage in prevention-oriented work, right? And that's, and that was for another episode, right? Because there's so much to think about there.
Yeah.
But, as virtual therapy becomes more prevalent, I don't have all the numbers, but I feel like, at least anecdotally, talking to a lot of special education directors in different areas, they're having more virtual SLPs than before, right? Partially because of staffing, like you mentioned, staffing shortages, but I think a factor of it is SLP driven too. Some people prefer, right? Even if they could find an in-person job, they're looking specifically for that job. And so how do they engage with all the different functions that happen within a school? SLPs wear so many hats. We all know that, right? They do interventions, assessments, prevention, collaboration, all of those things. And I think a lot of the studies that have been done on virtual, speech language services have focused on assessment and intervention, which makes sense, right? That's kind of our bread and butter. But thinking about all the different functions and how those intersect with virtual therapy, I think that there's room for a lot more research to explore it. And, spoiler alert, like other things, is that there are some things that virtual therapy really facilitates, right? And in some ways makes easier. There are other things that it makes harder. Some of the challenges are the same. And so there's a lot of subtlety to kind of explore. I think it's not a, yes, it's equally effective, or, no, it's not. It's, lots of different contextual factors related to the school and even the therapists themselves, right? What kind of support they have, what their caseload is like, what training they get, right? All of these things matter. It's not just a, this versus that, which one is, more impactful versus the other.
Right. I'm sorry. I had literally had a flashback to hybrid and I did not like it. I'm sorry, everybody.
I feel like it's nobody's favorite.
If anybody just saw me right then, I literally flashed back to the thought of hybrid when you were trying to manage in person and then you had some on the computer, and that people was insanity.
That was insanity. And what's so different now with virtual therapists is like, now when you're a virtual therapist, you're not doing it because of an emergency.
No,
right?
Exactly.
And so that feels very, very different than the experiences of doing it because it's an emergency. And that hybrid piece, which came up a lot in my middle study, right? The another moment in time. Some people had, some kids sitting there in person, some kids on Zoom in the same session. I would say, if we're going to think about things that aren't impactful, that was probably the hardest, right? It's the consistency of where people are and trying to manage both. That was rough. And we did that for a while, right? I mean,
right. And then
school-based
sometimes
SLPs.
the kids, yeah, sometimes the kids were there, then they'd have to go virtual. And then we had to get to a point where parents, no, you're either in or you're out. I mean, we went through so much. And so
We
did the
went through
parents too.
so
Yeah.
much. We just can't forget that. I feel like we're such a strong, resilient profession. In some ways, we're just like right back at it. But we went through so much and so many demands, like the hybrid, the in-person,
Yeah.
the virtual. And I think the fact that we're all just moving forward and trying to navigate it and figure it out, like it's incredible.
It is. It is. We don't ever want to go back.
No, no, let's hope
You know,
not.
we're stronger because we went through it. And I do, again, some of the benefits from it is the virtual aspect.
Mhm.
Again, with the meetings, yes, sometimes, but then teletherapy being an option for a lot of SLPs that want to provide services on that platform doesn't work for every student. And again, neither does in person for every student, I guess. Looking at it case by case basis, I'm sure it would be hard to find outcomes specifically because each student's different and each,
So many factors to consider.
oh, so many.
There's so many. And I think, I'm kind of excited to see continued research on that. I think, there was sort of a lot of research that happened about virtual therapy for SLPs that happened in the height of the pandemic, right? And I think that's so distinctly different from now when we're doing virtual therapy where we're intentional, right? Like it isn't that it's a
Mhm. Yeah,
emergency, that there is time to reflect on, the best practice and the best ways to do things. And it's so distinctly different than in the middle of the public health emergency when people
yeah,
were
yeah.
scrambling to do it. But it evened the playing field, right? In some ways, it wasn't what we wanted, but it evened the playing field. Everybody got some, or most people in schools got some virtual
Sure.
experience.
And I think the other thing that you mentioned earlier that really was, well, two things you mentioned. One, the fact that the materials that we were using, the really being able to utilize technology more, first out of necessity. And then second, I love the fact that it is now intentional.
Mhm.
Being able to get those Promethean boards, those whiteboards, whatever your school has, and getting the kids. Yes, I know when you said that some would say, oh, they're too tech heavy, I don't want to use tech. But then when we're thinking about engagement in the
Mhm.
session, and you're able to use an interactive platform, a digital interactive platform that's getting all the kids engaged, not sitting and waiting, I see a benefit there too.
Right, right. And exposure to digital tools, which existed before, but
Yep.
I think again, it accelerated, right? In some ways, the
Yeah.
pandemic accelerated our exposure to a lot of things. And most people were learning about boom cards and interactive boards and so many materials that we've shared with each other. And I feel like it's a very generous profession, right? Like
Yes.
there's so much more that we can just see on social media and other places about things that people have put together. Some things we pay for,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of free things too, right? That people they try things with their students and they upload them somewhere. There's a lot of different sites and they share them. So that ability to kind of use these tools and not have to always reinvent the wheel, I think changes the way people think about therapy too, and the availability of materials.
That was the second thing. So the first was using technology, but the second thing that you said, and you just said it again, and I love it, is the fact that we are able to share with our neighbors that we didn't even know before. Being able to put it out there into SLP world. And we do love sharing our goodies.
I feel like we're the most sharing people. People
We
love to
are.
share, right?
I think about I'm very specific that I'm doing dysphagia, feeding, swallowing in the schools, which love. I don't just want my kids to be amazing and be safe and progress and, I'd be glorious. I want every single student to benefit from amazing speech services, not just, and I think SLPs, we are like that. We do want to share and we are very lucky. And it has opened up our world
Absolutely.
not only just nationally, internationally, talking with,
Mhm.
clinicians all over the place, especially kind of bonding on what we do. And we want new tips and tricks in our toolbox. Wow, that was hard. But the more that we can get, the better we become. So again, check another
Right.
positive, another
And
positive.
also, the time savings that has too, right? Like if you
Mm,
make something amazing and you share it and someone else gets it, that means that they don't have to, maybe make it, right? Like maybe it's a flip,
right.
maybe it's a handout, and even sort of gathering in virtual spaces. I don't
Mhm.
consider myself a big social media person, but after the pandemic, when I was talking about MTSS, somebody said, "Oh, I'd love to keep having this conversation." And I started a Facebook page about speech language pathologists for
Mhm.
MTSS. And it just kept growing, and people come on and share ideas and materials, and I'm able to interact with people. So that was a post-pandemic thing for me. And
Mhm.
I feel like that is just another example of what we're talking about, people coming together and giving even advice, sharing materials, all of those things. So,
Sorry, you went out for you. I did. It could be me. I didn't hear you for a second, but
oh,
you're
I'm
back.
sorry. I feel like you look like for me that you froze for a second, but
Okay, it
I was
must have
just
been me.
saying, either way, just this idea of having these more spaces where people aren't just sharing materials, but they're sharing advice and support. And,
Absolutely. I love
you know,
it. People have more access to me. I just had somebody reach out to me in a district that I've not been to. They saw me virtually somewhere, and I mean it. Reach out to me, ask me a question. I collaborate. I am the biggest collaborator. I don't hide what I have. I want to share it. And I was like answering the questions and loving it. I love collaboration. And then at one point I was like, you know what? I can't answer that question without us, like, we need face to face. So I mean, there are some limitations. Sometimes I do need to, I mean, it's still virtual, I guess. Yeah, we're gonna do a Zoom,
you
but
may hop on a Zoom with
I
someone
love it.
in a second, right?
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
I'm the same way. I feel like people reach out to me, and I'm always happy to share. And sometimes it's the same thing. I'm like, let's set up a Zoom, like let's
Mhm.
talk. It doesn't matter if you're on the opposite coast or in
Yeah.
Canada or other places, like we can share. And I think people that just became a lot more normal
Hmm.
post-pandemic. It wasn't that it was impossible before. There were phones. It was just 5 years ago. But I think it did accelerate it, which,
It
as
did.
terrible as the pandemic was, I feel like it's fun to talk about some of the good silver linings that came out of it.
Absolutely. Again, going back to materials, not then I had a flashback to doing all that laminating and cutting out and making a folder, making those hands-on things versus getting something digital, not having to print and copy and no, I don't even want to say the dirty word worksheet.
Yeah.
I didn't even say it, people. I didn't even say it. Oh, Jody, I don't want to. Do you mind sharing your Facebook site?
Oh, absolutely. Can I put it in the chat?
Yeah, do please, please, please.
All right, I will do that. And certainly anyone is welcome. I think that this is it. Make sure I got the right thing. Yep, speech language pathologist for MTSS. And I love it. I feel like I've made a lot of great connections with people there, and people come and ask questions about MTSS implementation, which, was certainly part of the conversation before the pandemic. Like I talked about in my survey, I think people are realizing
Mhm.
its importance, wanting to engage more, thinking more about it. And so it's been a nice space to talk about things. Sometimes I have live Facebook events where we just all get on and talk and share resources, or
Oh,
invite people
wow.
just to learn. It's not formal like this. It's a little bit
Hmm.
more, informal. If there's been,
Hmm.
recently there was a lot of questions about universal screeners, right? What's a good universal screener? How do you implement universal screening? And that's really part of the tier 1 of MTSS. And since I saw so many questions, I said, let's all just have a conversation about it. And I brought some people that I thought were experts in that area. And we just had a Q&A time. And it's nice to be able to just jump on, ask your questions, have a conversation in real time. So certainly feel free to join. I'd be happy to see anybody there.
Do you mind? Because we do have some just listening, so not live, and they might be listening in their car in a little bit, or on Monday when it loads again. Could you tell us what they need to put in you said speech language pathologist or SLP for MTSS? What is it?
Yes, it's called speech language pathologist for MTSS. So,
Speech language pathologist for MTSS.
yep, that's
Okay,
it.
just saying it for those in the back.
Okay,
Make sure
perfect. All are welcome.
Yay. Oh my gosh, Lesley, I literally just looked at the time and I cannot believe our hour is up. This has
It
been
was so
amazing.
fast.
Oh my gosh, so
Thank you
fast.
so
And
much for having me. This
oh my
was
gosh, no,
such a
thank
wonderful
you.
conversation, and I really appreciate you inviting me, and so much to think about. I feel like I want to go write another paper right now,
Well, I will be following you. I don't say stalking. I'm just going to be following you because I want definitely, I want, and I do want you to come back. Actually, I'm really interested in getting more about that preventative, that MTSS, the RTI. I haven't really had an episode on that. So I think that would be really great if that's
Well,
something
I
you'd
would
be.
love, that's like my favorite topic.
Okay,
Love
done.
talking about the pandemic, but
Yeah.
MTSS is one of my very favorite things to talk about. So anytime.
All right, so we're going to shake off the pandemic. We got it off. We all got, we got through it. We've done that. We're taking the positive that we're all sharing that with the virtual. Yeah, that's a big yay. And just sharing and having the platforms to be able to share and access to people that you might not have had access before.
Right.
So, all right, I know I want to keep going, but I honor your time. I just want to thank you so much for being with us. You have been amazing. It's been phenomenal. Just hearing all that you've done, and I've loved it. I really love. And so thank you for being on School of Speech. Yay.
Of course, I'd love to come again. I'm so glad that we connected. I hope we meet in person in real life one day.
I can't wait. Yes, we are. We will. We're going to make that happen, but you are definitely coming on again. I just need to thank everybody for listening. Thank you everyone for listening. But I know it's time for us to say goodbye. I do want to thank absolutely everybody for tuning in, and I really hope that I see everybody on our next episode. Okay, guys. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Such a pleasure to be here. Talk soon.
Talk soon.